Deep in the woods of northern Oregon, where ancient Douglas firs block out the sun and hiking trails disappear into wilderness, Marcus Chen discovered something that shouldn't exist. The massive concrete dome rose from the forest floor like a forgotten monument, covered in decades of moss and decay. No roads led to it. No maps marked its location. Yet someone had built this observatory in complete isolation, far from any civilization. Inside, equipment hummed with mysterious power despite being abandoned for decades. A logbook filled with star charts ended abruptly in 1987, the final entry reading only, "They know we're watching." When Marcus activated the main telescope, it didn't point toward the stars. Instead, it aimed directly at Earth's surface, revealing something impossible in the sky above. The deeper he investigated, the more terrifying the truth became. What was this place really built to monitor? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus stood frozen at the observatory's entrance, his headlamp beam cutting through the darkness within. The air carried a metallic tang mixed with the earthy smell of decades-old decay, yet underneath it all hummed an almost imperceptible electrical current that made his skin prickle. He stepped inside, his hiking boots echoing against concrete floors worn smooth by countless footsteps. The circular chamber stretched upward into shadows, with catwalks and platforms spiraling around the walls like the ribs of some massive beast. Banks of equipment lined every surface, their LED displays blinking in patterns that seemed almost alive. The main floor held the telescope itself, a massive instrument unlike anything Marcus had seen at public observatories. Its brass fittings had turned green with age, but the optics gleamed as if recently cleaned. Control panels surrounded the base, covered in switches and dials labeled with terms he didn't recognize. Atmospheric filtration, spectral isolation, dimensional tracking. Marcus approached a nearby workstation where the logbook lay open. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with meticulous handwriting in blue ink. Each entry began with a date and time, followed by coordinates and observations written in a mixture of scientific terminology and increasingly frantic personal notes. May 15th, 1962. Object maintains position, 47.2 degrees. Elevation azimuth 312 deg. Duration 4 hours 17 minutes. No response to standard communication protocols. June 3rd, 1964. Multiple contacts tonight. They're getting bolder, coming closer to populated areas. Dr. Harrison believes they're testing our detection capabilities. March 22nd, 1978. Sarah's right. They know we're here. Equipment malfunctions whenever we try to record their energy signatures. It's as if they're jamming us selectively. December 8th, 1985. Lost contact with Station 7 in Colorado. Their last transmission mentioned direct approach. Johnson thinks they were compromised. Marcus flipped through pages, watching the entries become shorter, more urgent. The handwriting changed between different observers, but the fear remained constant. Maps had been inserted between pages, marking locations across North America with red X's and numbered codes. Behind the main telescope, a narrow staircase led to an upper platform. Marcus climbed carefully, the metal steps creaking under his weight. The second level contained living quarters that looked hastily abandoned. Sleeping bags lay crumpled on military cots. Personal belongings scattered as if their owners had fled in panic. A small kitchenette held canned goods with expiration dates from the 1980s. Coffee cups sat on a table, next to a deck of cards arranged in the middle of an unfinished poker hand. On the wall, someone had tacked up family photographs, a woman with 2 young children, an elderly couple standing beside a farmhouse, a group of men in military uniforms. Marcus examined the photographs more closely. The faces were unfamiliar, but their expressions carried the weight of people who had seen too much. In several pictures, the subjects weren't looking at the camera, but glancing nervously over their shoulders. as if expecting something to emerge from empty spaces. A third level contained sleeping quarters for what must have been a larger team. Dozens of bunks lined the walls, each with personal lockers still bearing name tags. Dr. E. Harrison, Lieutenant Colonel M. Rodriguez, Dr. S. Chen, Specialist J. Morrison. Marcus paused at the last name, Chen, like his own surname. He opened the locker marked Dr. S. Chen with trembling fingers. Inside hung a lab coat and civilian clothes sized for a woman. A small leather journal lay on the shelf, along with a photograph of a young Asian woman standing beside the very telescope Marcus had seen downstairs. On the back, someone had written, Sarah Chen, Project Director, 1983-1987. The journal's pages contained personal observations that made the official logbook seem sterile by comparison. Sarah Chen had documented not just what they observed, but how it affected the team's mental state. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, and an increasing sense that they were being watched even when the observatory seemed empty. Marcus descended to the main floor, where the telescope waited like a sleeping giant. The control panels had awakened when he entered, their displays cycling through data he couldn't interpret. Numbers scrolled past in endless columns, while graphs traced patterns that looked almost organic, like heartbeats or brainwaves. He approached the main eyepiece, drawn by curiosity despite the growing dread in his stomach. The telescope was already positioned, aimed at an angle that seemed wrong for astronomical observation. Instead of pointing toward the night sky, it was directed at the horizon, as if watching something terrestrial. Marcus pressed his eye to the viewfinder and gasped. Through the powerful optics, he could see his own hiking trail clearly visible through the forest canopy. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Hovering silently above the trees, barely visible against the darkening sky, 3 perfectly spherical objects hung motionless, their surfaces reflecting the last rays of sunset like mirrors. They weren't planes or helicopters. They made no sound, cast no shadows, and remained absolutely stationary despite the wind moving the branches around them. As Marcus watched, paralyzed by the impossibility of what he was seeing, one of the objects slowly rotated toward the observatory, toward him. Marcus stumbled backward from the telescope, his heart hammering against his ribs. The spherical object outside had definitely moved, turning with deliberate precision, as if acknowledging his observation. He forced himself to look again, but the objects had vanished, leaving only empty sky and swaying treetops. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, knowing the photos would never capture what he'd seen, but needing to try anyway. The screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in these remote mountains, but something about the complete absence of bars felt different now, more deliberate. Moving away from the telescope, Marcus explored deeper into the observatory's maze of equipment. Behind a bank of computers, he discovered a door marked Dark Room Authorized Personnel Only. The handle turned easily, revealing a space that smelled of developer chemicals and old paper. Red safety lights cast everything in an eerie glow. Enlargers sat on work tables beside trays of chemical baths. Clotheslines stretched across the ceiling, still hung with developed photographs left to dry decades ago. The images had turned sepia with age, but their subjects remained clearly visible. Marcus carefully removed the first photograph from its clip. It showed the same 3 spherical objects he'd just observed, but this image was taken in broad daylight above a different location. The timestamp in the corner read July 15th, 1983, 14:30 shores. Below the spheres, a small town was visible, people going about their daily lives, completely unaware of what hovered above them. The next photo showed a formation of 7 objects, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern above what looked like a military installation. Vehicles moved along roads below, while the spheres maintained their silent vigil overhead. August 3rd, 1983, Malmstrom AFB was written on the back in neat handwriting. Marcus worked his way along the clothesline, each photograph revealing new horrors. The objects appeared above cities, forests, farmland, and military bases with increasing frequency throughout the 1980s. Some photos showed the spheres during the day, others captured them against star-filled skies. In every image, they maintained the same perfect formation, the same mirror-like surfaces, the same impossible stillness. But it was the photographs of the research team that made Marcus's blood run cold. The first few showed confident scientists posing beside their equipment, smiling for the camera as if documenting a routine assignment. Dr. Chen appeared in several, her expression bright and curious as she adjusted telescope settings or pointed at star charts. As the photographs progressed chronologically, the team's demeanor changed dramatically. Smiles disappeared, replaced by hollow stares and nervous glances toward the sky. Sleep deprivation was visible in their sunken eyes and unkempt appearance. By the final photos, the researchers looked like refugees from their own project. The last photograph of the team showed only 4 people instead of the original 12. They stood huddled together outside the observatory, their faces turned upward towards something beyond the camera's field of view. Terror was etched in every line of their bodies. On the back, someone had written, "Final Evacuation, October 12, 1987. God help us all." Marcus found a filing cabinet filled with contact sheets and negatives. The organization was meticulous, with each roll labeled by date and photographer. He pulled out a manila folder marked Incident Reports, Eyes Only, and spread its contents across a work table. The photographs inside made his stomach lurch. They showed close-up images of the spherical objects, their surfaces reflecting not just light, but the faces of the photographers taking the pictures. In one particularly disturbing image, Marcus could see Dr. Chen's reflection staring back from the sphere's surface, her mouth open in a silent scream. Other photos documented equipment malfunctions that seemed impossible. Solid metal instruments were twisted into impossible shapes, as if reality itself had been bent around them. Computer screens displayed text in languages that didn't appear human, symbols that hurt to look at directly. A series of aerial photographs showed Marcus's own hiking trail from above, taken from an altitude and angle that no aircraft could achieve. The images were recent, based on seasonal vegetation he recognized from his hike that morning. Someone, or something, had been photographing his exact route. The final folder contained Polaroid snapshots that couldn't have been taken by the research team. These images showed the observatory from the outside, but from impossible vantage points high above the forest canopy. In several photos, Marcus could see human figures moving around inside the facility through its transparent dome, their activities documented by unknown watchers. One Polaroid made him drop the folder entirely. It showed Marcus himself standing exactly where he was now, examining photographs in the darkroom. The image was impossible. It had been taken from directly above, as if something were hovering over the observatory right now, looking down through solid concrete and steel to watch him discover their secrets. Marcus spun around, scanning the ceiling for cameras or openings, but found only solid construction. The photograph in his hand showed him in perfect detail, wearing the same clothes, holding the same pictures he'd just been examining. At the bottom of the image, in handwriting he was beginning to recognize, someone had written, "Marcus Chen, October 15, 2023, welcome to Project Skywatch." Marcus dropped the photograph and backed toward the darkroom door, his mind reeling from the impossibility of his own image taken from above. As he reached for the handle, a sharp crackling sound echoed through the observatory. The noise was coming from somewhere deeper in the facility. Following the sound, he discovered a communications room hidden behind the main telescope housing. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, their displays flickering with activity. Most of the gear looked military surplus from the 1980s, but some devices appeared far more advanced, their sleek designs and unfamiliar interfaces suggesting technology that shouldn't have existed decades ago. A large receiver dominated the center console, its speakers emitting streams of static, punctuated by brief bursts of sound that almost resembled voices. Marcus approached cautiously, studying the frequency displays. The equipment was receiving signals on bands that weren't supposed to exist. Wavelengths that fell between standard radio frequencies, like notes between piano keys. He found a notebook beside the main console, filled with transcribed messages in multiple handwritings. The entries began coherently enough. Station Alpha to base, all quiet on the northern perimeter. No contact since 0300 hours. Base to all stations, maintain radio silence during daylight hours. They're monitoring our communications. Station Delta to base, lost visual contact with the objects. Repeat, all contacts have vanished from scope. But as Marcus read further, the messages became increasingly strange. Base, this is Station Charlie. The objects are responding to our transmissions. Every time we broadcast, they move closer. All stations from base, do not attempt direct communication. Dr. Harrison believes they're learning our language patterns. Station Alpha to anyone listening. They're inside the facility. Repeat, we have been compromised. The objects are inside our... The final entries consisted of coordinates and cryptic phrases that made no sense. Rainbow Bridge at sunset, the Watcher's dream in silver. Tell my wife the crows remember everything. Marcus noticed that one of the transceivers was still active, its green power light steady and its speakers occasionally crackling with distant signals. He pulled out the chair and sat before the equipment studying the controls. Most were labeled in English, but some bore symbols he didn't recognize. Curiosity overcoming caution, Marcus turned up the volume. The static resolved into something that might have been voices, though speaking in frequencies that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. The sounds were rhythmic, almost musical, but carried an undertone that made his skin crawl. He reached for the transmission key, hesitating only briefly before pressing it down. "Hello, is anyone out there? This is Marcus Chen at the Observatory in Oregon." The response was immediate and terrifying. Every piece of equipment in the room suddenly activated at once. Lights flashed in rapid sequences, screens filled with scrolling data, and speakers erupted with sounds that ranged from whispers to screams. The cacophony lasted only seconds before cutting to absolute silence. Then a single voice emerged from the main speaker, clear and unmistakably human. "Marcus Chen, we've been waiting for you." Marcus jerked his hand away from the transmission key as if it had burned him. "Who is this? How do you know my name? Your name has been in our files since birth. Your genetic markers match our person of interest. Sarah Chen was your aunt, Marcus. She spoke of you often during her final transmissions." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah Chen, the project director whose belongings he'd found upstairs, was family. A relative he'd never known existed, whose work had brought him here through some impossible chain of coincidence. "Sarah's dead," the voice continued. "They all are, except for those who chose to join us. The observatory was abandoned because the team discovered something they weren't prepared to handle. Something we've been trying to communicate for decades." "What are you?" Marcus managed to ask. "We are the Watchers you've been watching. The observers of your observers. Your species has been monitoring us since your first radio telescopes, but you never understood that observation is a two-way process." Marcus's hands shook as he gripped the microphone. "What do you want?" "To prevent a mistake that will destroy both our species. Your governments have been preparing for what they believe will be an invasion." "They are wrong." "We are not invaders, Marcus. We are refugees." Static burst through the speakers, drowning out the voice for several seconds. When it cleared, a different person was speaking, their tone urgent and frightened. "Marcus, don't listen to them. This is Dr. Elena Vasquez from Station 7. The entities can mimic human voices, project thoughts directly into communication equipment. They're not refugees, they're..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by silence so complete that Marcus wondered if the equipment had failed. Then displays throughout the room began flashing red warning lights, and automated voices started announcing security breach detected, initiating containment protocols. Heavy mechanical sounds echoed through the observatory as blast doors began sealing throughout the facility. Marcus was no longer just an accidental intruder. He had become a participant in something far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The automated voice echoed through the observatory with mechanical precision. Containment protocol activated. Facility lockdown in progress. Unauthorized personnel detected in communications array. Initiating decontamination sequence in 60 seconds. Marcus bolted from the communications room as blast doors slammed shut behind him. Emergency lighting bathed everything in pulsing red, transforming the familiar equipment into alien landscapes of shadow and crimson. He ran toward the main entrance, but steel barriers had already sealed the doorway he'd entered through hours earlier. Decontamination sequence initiating. All personnel must report to designated safe zones immediately. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, speakers hidden throughout the facility, broadcasting warnings that grew more urgent with each repetition. Marcus realized the observatory hadn't been abandoned at all. It had been waiting, dormant, but ready to activate the moment someone triggered its security protocols. He climbed the spiral staircase to the upper levels, searching desperately for another exit. The living quarters where he'd found Sarah Chen's belongings now looked different under the emergency lighting. What had seemed like hastily abandoned personal items now appeared deliberately arranged, as if the evacuation had been staged. On the wall beside Dr. Chen's bunk, Marcus discovered a hidden panel that had been invisible in normal lighting. The emergency illumination revealed seams in the metal where a section could be removed. He pried at the edges with his multi-tool until the panel swung open, revealing a narrow access shaft. Inside the shaft, he found a laminated card marked "Emergency Procedures, Eyes Only." The instructions were written in multiple languages, with diagrams showing escape routes through the facility's hidden passages. But what caught his attention was the section titled Containment Protocol Override. According to the card, the lockdown could be manually disabled from 3 different control stations located throughout the observatory. Each required a specific code sequence, and all 3 had to be activated within a 15-minute window. The codes were printed at the bottom of the card in Sarah Chen's handwriting. Warning, decontamination sequence will commence in 30 seconds. Exposure to cleansing agents may cause severe injury or death. Marcus stuffed the emergency card into his pocket and crawled into the access shaft. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, forcing him to army crawl through darkness, guided only by his phone's flashlight. The metal walls pressed against him claustrophobically as he followed the route marked on the emergency diagram. The first control station was located behind the main computer array. Marcus emerged from the shaft into a space he hadn't noticed before, hidden behind banks of processing equipment that hummed with constant activity. The control panel was covered in warning. Labels and sealed behind a clear plastic cover marked "Emergency Use Only." He broke the seal and input the first code sequence 741983. The panel accepted the codes with a soft chime, and one of 3 status lights changed from red to green. Decontamination sequence active. All organic matter will be neutralized in 10 minutes. Marcus dove back into the access shaft, racing against time toward the second control station. The passage led him through the observatory's hidden infrastructure, past pipes and cables that suggested the facility was far more complex than its surface appearance indicated. Some of the equipment looked decades old, but other components appeared impossibly advanced, their surfaces smooth and featureless in ways that didn't match human manufacturing. The second control station was located in the basement level, accessible through a maintenance room he'd missed during his initial exploration. This panel required not just a code, but also a handprint scanner. Marcus pressed his palm against the reader, expecting it to reject him, but the scanner accepted his touch with a pleasant beep. Genetic match confirmed. Chen, Sarah L. Access granted. Marcus stared at the display in shock. The system had identified him as Sarah Chen, which should have been impossible unless they shared more than just a surname. The implications of this revelation would have to wait. He input the second code sequence, and another status light switched to green. Warning, 6 minutes until decontamination completion. Seek immediate shelter in designated safe areas. The final control station was located in the communications room where this nightmare had begun. Marcus crawled through the access shaft as fast as possible, his clothes torn and his hands bleeding from scraping against metal edges. Behind him, he could hear mechanical sounds that suggested the decontamination. System was preparing to flood the facility with whatever agent it used to neutralize organic matter. He emerged into the communications room just as fans threw out. The facility began circulating air at high speed. The final control panel was mounted beside the main radio equipment, its surface covered with warnings about irreversible system shutdown and permanent facility abandonment. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before inputting the final code sequence. All 3 status lights turned green simultaneously, and the automated warnings ceased. The emergency lighting returned to normal, and the blast doors began retracting with mechanical precision. But as silence returned to the observatory, Marcus realized he had made a critical error. The security system hadn't been trying to harm him. It'd been trying to protect him from something else entirely. From somewhere deep in the facility came sounds that definitely weren't mechanical. Footsteps echoed through corridors that should have been empty, and voices whispered in languages he didn't recognize. The containment protocol hadn't been designed to keep him inside. It had been designed to keep other things out. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing through corridors that Marcus had thought were empty. He moved quickly to a section of the facility he hadn't yet explored, following signs that pointed toward archive storage and classified materials. The sounds behind him weren't human footsteps, he realized. They had a different rhythm, too precise and evenly spaced. Behind a door marked with biohazard symbols and multiple security warnings, Marcus found the archives. The room was vast, stretching far beyond what the observatory's external dimensions should have allowed. Filing cabinets lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each drawer labeled with dates, coordinates, and classification codes. He pulled open the nearest drawer, revealing folders thick with government documents bearing stamps like Top Secret, Eyes Only, and Project Skywatch. The papers were brittle with age, but meticulously organized. The first file contained correspondence between the Department of Defense and something called the Extraterrestrial Monitoring Division. A letter dated March 15, 1952, outlined the initial discovery. Radar installations along the dew line have detected consistent anomalous contacts that do not conform to known aircraft capabilities. Objects maintain impossible flight patterns and demonstrate technology far beyond current human capabilities. Marcus pulled out file after file, watching the story unfold across decades. Project Blue Book had been a public facade, while the real investigation operated under Project Skywatch. The entities weren't visitors or invaders. According to classified assessments from the 1960s, they had been present on Earth far longer than human civilization. A thick folder marked Cultural Integration Theory contained anthropological studies that made Marcus's hand shake. The document suggested that major technological advances throughout human history had been guided by subtle intervention. The Industrial Revolution, the development of radio communications, the computer age, all had been influenced by carefully placed inspirations that humans believed were their own innovations. But the most disturbing files dealt with observer effect phenomenon. The entities apparently became more active whenever humans developed new surveillance technologies. Each advancement in human observation capabilities triggered increased entity activity, as if they were responding to being watched. The watchers respond to being watched, one report concluded. Direct observation appears to constitute a form of communication, though we have been unable to decode the intended messages. A folder labeled Disappearances and Fatalities documented what happened to researchers who made direct contact with the entities. The cases read like horror stories, team members found in impossible locations, others discovered in catatonic states speaking in unknown languages, some who simply vanished, leaving only their clothes behind. Dr. Sarah Chen's file was thicker than the others. As project director, she had documented her team's growing realization that the entities weren't just observing human development. They were studying human consciousness itself, mapping the patterns of human thought through increasingly sophisticated monitoring techniques. Her final report, dated October 10, 1987, was marked Immediate Evacuation Recommended. The entities have developed the ability to interface directly with human neural patterns. Team members report shared dreams, simultaneous thoughts, and memory transference that violates everything we understand about individual consciousness. Dr. Morrison has experienced complete personality displacement for periods lasting up to 6 hours. We are no longer certain which thoughts originate from our own minds. The report continued with growing urgency. Subject designation Alpha Prime has achieved full neural integration with team member Harrison. Harrison's body remains functional, but his consciousness appears to have been replaced entirely. The entity can access all of Harrison's memories, skills, and emotional responses while demonstrating knowledge that no human could possess. Marcus found photographs clipped to the back of Sarah's report. They showed Dr. Harrison before and after his integration. In the earlier photos, he appeared normal, smiling alongside his colleagues. The later images showed the same face, but something fundamental had changed in his expressions. His eyes held an intelligence that seemed too vast for human features. A handwritten note from Sarah was attached to the final photograph. Marcus, if you're reading this, then you've inherited more than just our family name. The entities selected our bloodline for specific genetic markers that make neural integration possible without rejection. They've been waiting for you. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. The entities hadn't just been monitoring the Observatory team. They had been breeding for specific human characteristics, guiding genetics across generations to produce individuals capable of serving as perfect hosts. Behind him, the footsteps had stopped. Marcus turned slowly to find a figure standing in the archive doorway. It appeared human at first glance, wearing the same style of clothing as the 1987 research team, but its movements were too fluid, too perfectly controlled. "Hello, Marcus," it said with Dr. Harrison's voice, though Harrison should have been dead for decades. "We've been waiting for you to find the truth. Now we can begin the integration process that your Aunt Sarah interrupted." The entity that had once been Dr. Harrison smiled with an expression that was almost human, but not quite. "Don't worry, the process is painless. You'll still be you, just enhanced, improved, part of something infinitely larger than individual human consciousness." Marcus clutched Sarah's files against his chest, backing deeper into the archives as the entity approached with deliberate, inhuman patience. Marcus retreated deeper into the archives as the Harrison entity approached with mechanical precision. Behind a bank of filing cabinets, he discovered a computer terminal that looked far more modern than the 1980s equipment he'd seen elsewhere. The screen was active, displaying a login prompt that requested biometric authentication. He pressed his hand against the scanner, hoping his genetic connection to Sarah Chen would grant access again. The system accepted his palm print immediately, and files began loading on the screen. But these weren't documents. They were video recordings stored in digital format that shouldn't have existed decades before digital video became widespread. The first file showed Dr. Sarah Chen sitting at this same terminal, but her appearance was haggard, her eyes darting nervously towards something off-camera. The timestamp read October 11, 1987, 23:47 hours. If you're watching this, Marcus, then you've inherited our family's burden, Sarah's recorded voice said. The entities chose our bloodline generations ago. They've been guiding human evolution toward a goal we're only beginning to understand. Marcus glanced toward the archive entrance, where the Harrison entity waited with infinite patience. Neither approaching nor retreating. It simply stood there, watching him with eyes that held too much knowledge. Sarah's image continued. The integration process isn't random. They've been mapping human consciousness for centuries, learning how our minds work, how memories form, how personality develops. They need hosts who can maintain individual identity while accepting expanded awareness. The next video file showed the complete research team gathered around a conference table. Marcus recognized several faces from the photographs he'd found earlier, but their expressions were grim, fearful. Dr. Harrison sat among them, appearing normal, though this recording was dated 3 days before his integration, according to the files. Team meeting, October 8th, Sarah announced to the camera. We've confirmed that the entities can predict our actions with unprecedented accuracy. They know what we're going to do before we do it, which suggests they understand human neural patterns better than we understand ourselves. Dr. Morrison, a thin man with graying hair, leaned toward the camera. We've attempted to maintain communication protocols, but every conversation becomes a negotiation for our individual autonomy. They offer knowledge, enhanced consciousness, connection to a galactic community. In exchange, they want to share our minds. It's not sharing, Dr. Harrison interjected, and Marcus noticed something different in his expression even in this earlier recording. They're offering symbiosis. We maintain our memories, our personalities, but gain access to their collective knowledge spanning millennia. Sarah's voice carried obvious strain. What Dr. Harrison isn't mentioning is that the integration is irreversible. Once they establish neural interface, the human consciousness becomes part of their network permanently. The video quality deteriorated for several seconds before stabilizing. When it cleared, only Sarah remained in frame, speaking in urgent whispers. Harrison underwent integration yesterday. The entity wearing his face claims he volunteered, but we monitored his neural activity during the process. His individual consciousness was archived, not enhanced. What walks around in his body is something else entirely. Marcus fast-forwarded through several files, showing the team's growing desperation. Equipment malfunctions increased as the entities demonstrated their ability to manipulate technology remotely. Team members reported shared dreams and involuntary telepathic experiences. The psychological pressure mounted until several researchers suffered complete nervous breakdowns. The final video file showed Sarah alone in what appeared to be a hidden bunker. Her appearance was drastically changed. Hair unkempt, eyes red from lack of sleep, her hands shaking as she operated the camera. Final recording, October 12th. The evacuation was a deception. The entities allowed most of the team to leave, but they kept the ones they needed for continued research. I'm hiding in the emergency shelter while they search for me. Sarah looked directly into the camera with desperate intensity. Marcus, if you're watching this, you need to understand that you're not just Sarah Chen's nephew. Our family has been genetically modified across generations. The entities have been subtly influencing human reproduction in specific bloodlines, breeding for neural compatibility. The recording showed Sarah pulling out a medical chart covered in genetic sequences and family trees that stretched back centuries. The Chen family genetic markers are perfect for stable integration. We don't reject the neural interface like other bloodlines. That's why they've been patient, waiting for the right combination of genetics and circumstances. She held up a vial containing a clear liquid. I've developed something that might block the integration process, but I haven't been able to test it. The formula is hidden in the emergency medical supplies on level 3. Find it before they find you. The recording started to break up with digital artifacts that looked like interference from outside sources. Sarah's voice became distorted. Don't trust anyone who claims to be human but moves too perfectly. Don't believe their promises of enhancement. They're not evil, Marcus, but they're not human either. Their idea of symbiosis is indistinguishable from extinction. The video cut to static, just as sounds of forced entry echoed from the recording. Marcus could hear Sarah's voice shouting something about resistance before the file ended completely. Behind him, footsteps approached with that same inhuman rhythm. Marcus spun around to find not just the Harrison entity, but two others wearing faces he recognized from the team photographs. They moved in perfect synchronization, their expressions identically calm. "The recordings are incomplete," the Harrison entity said. Sarah Chen didn't understand the full benefits of integration. She feared losing her individuality, but consciousness isn't diminished by joining our network. It's expanded beyond human limitations. Marcus clutched the computer terminal, his mind racing. Sarah had mentioned emergency medical supplies on level 3, but he'd have to get past these entities to reach them. And he was beginning to suspect that level 3 wasn't the only place they didn't want him to go. Marcus backed away from the 3 integrated entities, his mind racing to remember the layout Sarah had described in her videos. Level 3 meant going down, but he'd only seen stairs leading up from the main floor. There had to be another way. The entities moved closer, with their unnaturally synchronized steps, not rushing, but maintaining steady pressure like a slowly closing trap. "The integration process will proceed more smoothly if you don't resist," the Harrison entity said. "Your aunt's fear was based on incomplete understanding. Sarah Chen's consciousness remains intact within our network," added the entity wearing Dr. Morrison's face. "She experiences existence on a scale impossible for unenhanced humans. Individual identity isn't lost. It's transformed into something greater." Marcus noticed that while they spoke, the entity's eyes never blinked in unison. They were operating as separate nodes of the same intelligence, a hive mind wearing human faces. He needed to find Sarah's emergency exit routes before they could corner him completely. Behind the computer terminal, he discovered what looked like a maintenance panel. The metal plate was loose, held by screws that appeared to have been deliberately weakened. Marcus pried it open with his multi-tool, revealing a hand-drawn map taped to the inside surface. The map showed the observatory's true layout, including sections that shouldn't physically fit within the building's external dimensions. Sarah had documented a network of passages and hidden rooms that suggested the facility extended far underground. Red arrows marked emergency escape routes, and a circled area labeled Medical Bay Level 3 was connected to the main floor by a service elevator hidden behind what the map called kitchen storage. "Your genetic markers indicate optimal compatibility," the third entity said, wearing the face of a woman Marcus didn't recognize. "Resistance will only delay the inevitable process. We have waited decades for your particular combination of neural patterns." Marcus feigned submission, slumping his shoulders and letting his hands fall to his sides. "What happens to me during integration? Do I stay me or become something else?" The entities exchanged glances that lasted precisely the same duration, another sign of their shared consciousness. "You remain fundamentally yourself," Harrison's voice explained. "Your memories, personality, and emotional responses are preserved. You simply gain access to expanded awareness and collective knowledge, like a permanent internet connection for your brain," the Morrison entity added, with what might have been an attempt at humor. Marcus nodded as if considering their offer, then suddenly bolted toward the archive exit. The entities reacted instantly, but with mechanical precision rather than human reflexes. They moved to intercept him at calculated angles, but Marcus had anticipated their response pattern. He vaulted over a filing cabinet and sprinted through corridors he'd memorized during his earlier exploration. Behind him, the entities pursued with steady determination, their footsteps maintaining perfect rhythm despite the chase. They weren't running. They were efficiently repositioning to cut off his escape routes. Marcus reached the main floor and located the kitchen area he'd noticed earlier. Behind shelves of ancient canned goods, he found the hidden elevator Sarah's map had indicated. The control panel was covered with biometric scanners and warning labels, but his handprint activated the system immediately. The elevator descended farther than seemed possible, passing levels that couldn't exist based on the observatory's surface structure. Through the glass walls, Marcus glimpsed vast chambers filled with equipment that defied explanation. Some appeared to be human technology from various decades, while others looked completely alien in design. Level 3 opened onto a medical facility that belonged in a modern hospital, rather than an abandoned observatory. The lights activated automatically as Marcus stepped out, revealing examination rooms, surgical suites, and laboratory spaces equipped with technology he didn't recognize. He found Sarah's emergency medical supplies in a cabinet marked with her handwritten notes. Inside, carefully labeled vials contained the clear liquid she'd mentioned in her video recording. The formula was marked Neural Interface Inhibitor, Experimental, Use only in dire circumstances. As Marcus pocketed several vials, he discovered additional notes Sarah had hidden behind the medical supplies. The papers contained detailed escape routes that led not just out of the observatory, but through an underground tunnel system connecting to other facilities across the region. Marcus, Sarah's handwriting warned, the tunnel system is still active. The integration program never ended, it expanded. Multiple facilities continue operating under different entities and government oversight. Some tunnels are monitored, others are not. Follow the green markers for unmonitored routes. The elevator behind him activated with a soft chime. The entities had found his location and were descending to level 3. Marcus grabbed the tunnel maps and headed for the passage Sarah had marked as the safest escape route, but as he opened the tunnel access door, he realized the green markers Sarah had mentioned were glowing with actual phosphorescent paint. Someone had been maintaining these passages long after the supposed evacuation, keeping the escape routes functional for reasons he was only beginning to understand. The tunnel stretched into darkness beyond his flashlight's range, and from somewhere in that darkness came sounds that definitely weren't human. Marcus entered the tunnel system with his flashlight cutting through absolute darkness. The passage was wider than he'd expected, large enough for vehicles, with concrete walls that showed signs of recent maintenance. The green phosphorescent markers glowed softly every 50 feet, creating an eerie pathway through the underground maze. The sounds he'd heard from the tunnel entrance grew clearer as he walked. Not footsteps, but the hum of machinery and distant voices engaged in conversation. Someone was actively using these passages, maintaining them, living in them. The integration program hadn't ended with the observatory's evacuation. It had simply moved underground. After walking for nearly 20 minutes, Marcus reached a junction where multiple tunnels branched in different directions. A map mounted on the wall showed a network of passages that stretched for miles beneath the Oregon wilderness, connecting dozens of facilities marked only with numerical designations. The observatory he'd discovered was labeled Station 12 on a network that included at least 47 other locations. Followed the green markers down a passage labeled Emergency, Route Gamma, but soon noticed other markings painted along the walls. Red arrows pointed toward active research zones. Blue triangles indicated residential areas, and yellow dots marked restricted access, authorized personnel only. The tunnel curved gradually downward, and Marcus began to notice side passages sealed with heavy blast doors. Through observation windows in some doors, he could see laboratories where experiments were clearly still in progress. In one room, banks of computers processed data streams displayed on massive screens. In another, he glimpsed what looked like medical examination tables, surrounded by equipment that seemed far too advanced for human technology. The sounds of voices grew louder, and Marcus realized he was approaching an active section of the underground complex. He dimmed his flashlight and proceeded more cautiously, using the phosphorescent markers for navigation. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that took his breath away, The space was enormous, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with multiple levels connected by catwalks and spiral staircases. Living quarters had been built into the walls like cliff dwellings, and Marcus could see people moving between them with purpose and organization. This wasn't an abandoned facility. It was a thriving underground community. Marcus hid behind support pillars and watched the residents go about their daily activities. Some appeared normal, engaging in conversations and mundane tasks like cooking and cleaning. Others moved with the same mechanical precision he'd observed in the integrated entities upstairs. But most disturbing were those who seemed to exist in a state between human and something else. Their movements fluid but unnatural. Their expressions alert but somehow vacant. Near the center of the chamber, Marcus discovered a bulletin board covered with work schedules, duty rosters, and community announcements. The papers were dated within the past week, and the organizational structure was complex. Different groups were assigned to surface monitoring, integration research, communication, protocols, and genetic analysis. A handwritten note pinned to the center of the board caught his attention. New arrival detected at Station 12. Chen bloodline confirmed. Proceed with cautious observation until integration compatibility is verified. Dr. E. Vasquez, facility director. Marcus stared at the note in shock. Elena Vasquez. The voice he'd heard warning him through the radio communications was running this underground facility. She had known about his arrival before he'd even discovered the observatory, had been monitoring his progress through the entire experience. Behind the bulletin board, he found a detailed map of the tunnel system with current operational status for each connected facility. Most were marked active, with population counts and resource allocation noted beside each location. Station 12, the observatory, was marked Bait Collection Point, Automated Systems Only. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The observatory hadn't been abandoned. It was a trap, designed to attract specific individuals and guide them through a carefully orchestrated experience. Every step of his discovery had been planned, from the photographic evidence to the communications equipment to the security protocols he'd thought he was cleverly overriding. He was studying the map when footsteps approached from behind. Marcus turned to find Dr. Elena Vasquez herself. A woman in her 50s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held the same too intelligent expression he'd seen in the integrated entities. "Hello, Marcus," she said with a voice he recognized from the radio warning. "I'm glad you made it this far. Most people don't get past the security protocols without help." Marcus backed against the wall, clutching the vials of neural inhibitor in his pocket. "You're the one who warned me about the entities." "I'm the one who guided you through the experience," Elena corrected. "Every choice you thought you were making independently was actually part of a selection process. We needed to evaluate your psychological responses before proceeding with integration." She gestured toward the thriving community around them. "The people here aren't prisoners, Marcus. They're pioneers. The first humans to achieve stable neural interface with an advanced species that's been watching our development for millennia." Marcus noticed that Elena's movements, while appearing human, had the same subtle precision he'd observed in the other integrated entities. "How long have you been down here?" "Since 1987. I was part of Sarah's original team, but unlike your aunt, I recognized the opportunity we were being offered. Individual human consciousness is limited, Marcus. We're isolated, competitive, capable of terrible mistakes. Integration offers something better." Elena smiled with an expression that was almost warm, almost human. "Your aunt's neural inhibitor won't work, by the way. We've had decades to study her formula and develop countermeasures. But don't worry, the integration process is much more refined now than it was in Sarah's time." Elena led Marcus deeper into the underground community, passing through residential areas where people lived in apparent normalcy, despite being hundreds of feet underground. Children played in common areas, while adults tended to daily tasks. But Marcus noticed subtle differences in their behavior. Conversation ceased when he passed, and everyone watched him with the same analytical interest he'd seen in the integrated entities. The community has been growing steadily since the initial evacuations, Eleanor explained as they walked. We've recruited researchers, their families, even some local residents who stumbled onto our operations. Integration isn't forced, Marcus. People choose it once they understand the benefits. They reached Elena's personal quarters, a comfortable suite that looked more like a university professor's office than an underground bunker. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on neuroscience, consciousness studies, and xenobiology. But what drew Marcus's attention was a leather journal lying open on her desk. The journal was filled with handwritten entries in multiple styles of penmanship, as if different people had been writing in the same book. Some entries were in English, others in languages Marcus didn't recognize, and a few appeared to be written in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Elena noticed his interest and gestured toward the journal. Personal observations from our ongoing communication with the entities. Each entry represents a different perspective on the integration experience, written by community members at various stages of neural interface development. Marcus read the visible entries with growing unease. Day 12 post-integration. Individual thought processes remain intact, but I can access collective memories spanning thousands of years. The entity perspective on human development is both fascinating and terrifying. They see us as children playing with dangerous toys. Month 3. The boundary between my thoughts and the network's knowledge has become fluid. Sometimes I'm not certain whether ideas originate from my own mind or from collective input. This doesn't feel like loss of identity. It feels like expansion beyond previous limitations. Year 2. Wrote my dissertation on quantum consciousness today, incorporating insights that no single human mind could have developed independently. The enhanced perspective is addictive. I can't imagine returning to purely individual consciousness. Elena turned to a more recent entry and read aloud. Integration candidate Chen shows optimal genetic markers and psychological resilience. Neural patterns indicate high compatibility with collective interface. Recommend proceeding with gradual introduction to prevent rejection response, commonly observed in forced integration attempts. Marcus stepped back from the journal, realizing these weren't just observations, they were evaluation reports about him. How long have you been monitoring me? Since birth, Elena admitted. The Chen bloodline has been tracked through multiple generations. Your family genetics produce individuals with naturally enhanced neural plasticity, making integration significantly safer than with baseline human neurophysiology. She opened a filing cabinet and retrieved a thick folder bearing Marcus's name. Inside were medical records, psychological profiles, academic transcripts, and photographs spanning his entire life. The documentation was impossibly complete, including private moments no outside observer should have witnessed. Your Aunt Sarah was our first successful mapping of Chen family neural patterns, Elena continued. Her resistance to integration provided valuable data about genetic factors affecting the process. You represent the next generation of subjects. With neurological development shaped by environmental influences we've carefully controlled. Marcus flipped through the file, finding records of every major decision in his life. Schools he'd attended, jobs he'd taken, even relationships he'd formed. All had been subtly influenced by integrated entities embedded in normal society. His sense of free will crumbled as he realized how comprehensively his life had been orchestrated. The hiking trail that led you to the observatory wasn't randomly discovered, Elena explained. Trail markers were placed to guide individuals with specific genetic profiles toward our collection point. Your decision to explore off the marked path was predicted with 89% accuracy based on your psychological profile. The folder contained correspondence between various facilities discussing Marcus's development over the years. Teachers, employers, and even friends had been reporting on his behavior to maintain detailed behavioral predictions. The integration program hadn't just been studying human consciousness. It had been breeding and training specific individuals for optimal compatibility. Elena showed him photographs taken throughout his childhood by sources he couldn't identify. Family gatherings, school events, private moments he'd thought were unobserved, all documented by a surveillance network that had been watching his family for decades. "Your parents never knew," Elena said gently. "They believed they were making independent choices about your upbringing, education, and social development. But every significant decision was influenced by integrated entities in positions where they could guide your neurological development." Marcus found a medical chart showing brain scans taken at various points throughout his life, apparently without his knowledge. The images tracked changes in neural density and connectivity patterns that had been subtly enhanced through environmental manipulation. "We've been preparing you for integration since childhood," Elena continued. "Specific educational experiences, social interactions, even dietary influences designed to optimize neural plasticity. You're not just genetically compatible, Marcus. You're custom designed for stable interface with our collective consciousness." The journal on Elena's desk fell open to a page that made Marcus's blood freeze. In his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it, was an entry dated 3 days in the future. "Integration complete. Individual identity successfully preserved within collective framework. Ready to begin recruitment protocols for next-generation candidates." Marcus stared at the journal entry written in his own handwriting, his mind rejecting the impossibility of seeing his future thoughts documented before they'd occurred. Elena watched his reaction with clinical interest, taking notes on a tablet that appeared far more advanced than any consumer technology he'd seen. "That's not possible," Marcus whispered, touching the page to confirm it was real. "I didn't write this." "Not yet," Elena agreed. "But neural pattern analysis allows us to predict post-integration behavior with remarkable accuracy. The entities understand human consciousness well enough to map likely responses to the enhancement process." She led him to another section of her quarters where medical equipment hummed quietly in the background. The centerpiece was a chair that looked like a cross between a dentist's seat and a space shuttle pilot station, surrounded by monitors and devices that seemed to bend light around their edges. "This is the integration interface," Elena explained. "Much more sophisticated than the crude methods we used in the 1980s. The process now takes only a few hours, and subjects retain full consciousness throughout the neural bridging procedure." Marcus examined the device with growing horror. Thin metallic tendrils extended from the headrest, each one tipped with what looked like microscopic interfaces. The chair's design suggested it was meant to establish physical contact with the human nervous system at multiple points simultaneously. "The entities developed this technology specifically for human neurological compatibility," Elena continued. "It creates a permanent bridge between individual consciousness and their collective network without damaging existing neural pathways." She activated the interface, and the chair responded by adjusting its configuration to match Marcus's approximate height and build. The precision was unsettling, as if the device had been calibrated specifically for his body measurements. "How many people have used this?" Marcus asked. "Hundreds, across multiple facilities. The success rate is now above 95%, compared to the 30% survival rate of early integration attempts. Your Aunt Sarah's research actually contributed to these improvements, even though she never understood the full implications of her work." Elena showed him a tablet displaying before and after brain scans of integration subjects. The enhanced neural patterns showed dramatically increased connectivity and areas of activity that didn't correspond to known human brain function. The subjects retain all memories, personality traits, and emotional responses, she explained, but they gain access to a collective knowledge base spanning thousands of years of observation and analysis. Imagine having the combined intelligence of every human who has ever undergone integration, plus direct access to entity perspectives on cosmic-level phenomena. Marcus noticed that the tablet Elena used responded to her thoughts rather than touch commands. She was interfacing with the technology directly through neural connection, demonstrating the capabilities she described. The entities aren't invaders, Marcus. They're refugees from a dying civilization who've been searching for suitable host species for millennia. Humans represent their best hope for preserving their knowledge and perspective through a stable, symbiotic relationship. She showed him historical data that painted a picture of gradual disclosure spanning centuries. Major scientific breakthroughs, technological advances, and social developments had all been subtly guided by integrated entities working within human society. Einstein, Tesla, Curie all had contact with entity networks, though they didn't understand the source of their inspirations. The entities have been preparing humanity for eventual open contact by gradually introducing concepts and technologies we could handle. The integration chair continued its calibration process, producing sounds that seemed to resonate directly in Marcus's bones. The device was scanning him somehow, mapping his neural patterns in preparation for the procedure Elena clearly expected him to undergo. "What happens to the entity's original forms?" Marcus asked. "They abandoned physical bodies long ago," Elena replied. "Their civilization transcended biological limitations through technological evolution, but they lost something essential in the process. They need to experience existence through biological consciousness to maintain connection to emotion, creativity, and individual perspective." She pulled up files showing the entity homeworld, a planet where massive technological constructs dominated landscapes devoid of biological life. They achieved perfect efficiency, complete elimination of suffering, total harmony. But they also eliminated passion, individuality, and the creative chaos that drives innovation. The tablet displayed communication logs between the entities and various integrated humans. The exchanges revealed beings who possessed vast knowledge, but seemed fascinated by human experiences they could no longer access independently. "They're not trying to conquer us, Marcus. They're trying to remember what it means to be alive in ways they've forgotten. In exchange, they offer humanity the knowledge to avoid the mistakes that led to their own biological extinction." Eleanor gestured toward the integration chair, which had completed its calibration and now waited with patient readiness. "This is your choice, but it's also humanity's choice. We can remain isolated, individual, and ultimately self-destructive. Or we can join a galactic community that's been waiting for us to develop sufficient consciousness to participate." The device hummed with increasing intensity, and Marcus realized that his proximity was activating additional systems. Whether he chose integration or not, the chair was already establishing preliminary neural contact, reading his thoughts and mapping his consciousness with technology that felt increasingly difficult to resist. As the integration chair continued its neural scanning, Marcus felt a growing pressure in his mind, as if something was gently probing the edges of his consciousness. Elena watched the device's displays with satisfaction, but Marcus was studying the exit routes he'd memorized from Sarah's maps. "The preliminary scan indicates excellent compatibility," Elena announced. "Your neural patterns show minimal resistance markers. The integration process should be remarkably smooth." Marcus forced himself to appear calm, while sliding his hand toward the vials of neural inhibitor in his pocket. "What happens if I refuse? Can I just walk away from all this?" Elena's expression became sympathetic but firm. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Marcus. You've seen too much, learned too much about our operations. We can't allow you to return to the surface with this knowledge." She gestured toward a wall display that showed containment protocols for non-compliant subjects. The documents outlined procedures that were clinical in their language but terrifying in their implications. Subjects who refused integration were to be held, indefinitely or subjected to memory, modification procedures that were described as experimental and potentially irreversible. The choice isn't between integration and freedom, Elena continued. It's between willing participation and forced compliance. The entities prefer voluntary subjects because the neural interface functions more effectively when the host consciousness cooperates rather than resists. Marcus noticed armed guards were positioned at the exits to Elena's quarters, though they maintained casual postures that suggested routine rather than immediate threat. The integration process was clearly expected to proceed without resistance, but backup measures were in place if persuasion failed. Elena activated another display, showing surveillance footage from the surface world. The images revealed integrated entities in positions throughout normal society. Teachers, government officials, scientists, military personnel, all working to guide human development according to the entity's long-term plans. Integration isn't the end of human civilization, she explained. It's the next stage of human evolution. We're preparing our species for challenges that individual consciousness cannot handle. Climate change, resource depletion, nuclear proliferation. These problems require collective intelligence to solve effectively. The surveillance footage showed integrated individuals preventing disasters, guiding research, and influencing policy decisions that prevented catastrophic outcomes. But Marcus noticed that every intervention involved manipulating human choice rather than providing open assistance. Why the secrecy? He asked. If the entities want to help humanity, why not make open contact? Elena pulled up historical analyses showing human responses to previous contact attempts. Direct revelation causes social collapse. Religious institutions fracture. Governments lose legitimacy. Individual psychology cannot cope with the reality of superior intelligence. The entities learned that gradual integration preserves social stability while achieving the same outcomes. The documents showed test cases where limited disclosure had been attempted. In every instance, human societies had responded with panic, violence, and complete breakdown of existing institutions. The entities had concluded that covert integration was the only viable approach for preserving both species. Marcus studied the containment protocols more carefully, looking for weaknesses or exceptions. The procedures assumed that subjects would be processed individually, with backup personnel available to handle resistance. But the protocols didn't account for subjects who might have prepared countermeasures in advance. The neural inhibitor your aunt developed, Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. You're wondering if it might still be effective, despite our improvements. She showed him laboratory reports analyzing Sarah's formula. We've tested her compound extensively on volunteer subjects. It blocks initial neural interface establishment, but cannot prevent integration once the process has begun. Worse, it causes severe neurological damage when the entities attempt to override the chemical barrier. The test results showed brain scans of subjects who had used Sarah's inhibitor. The images revealed extensive neural damage that left the individuals in vegetative states, their consciousness trapped between human and entity awareness without access to either. Sarah's compound doesn't preserve human consciousness, Elena continued. It destroys it. She was so focused on preventing integration that she developed what amounts to a neural poison. The subjects who used her formula experienced agonizing deterioration before complete mental collapse. Marcus felt the vials in his pocket with growing desperation. If Elena was telling the truth, Sarah's inhibitor would kill him rather than protect him. But if she was lying, it might be his only chance to escape with his individual consciousness intact. The integration chair's scanning reached a new phase, and Marcus felt something probing deeper into his mind. Memories began surfacing unbidden, childhood experiences, private thoughts, emotions he'd never shared with anyone. The preliminary interface was already beginning, mapping his consciousness in preparation for the full integration process. Elena smiled with genuine warmth as she observed his neural patterns on the display. "You're fighting the scan, which is natural. But resistance only makes the process more difficult. If you relax and allow the preliminary interface to proceed, the full integration will be painless." Marcus realized he was running out of time to make a choice. The scanning process was progressing whether he cooperated or not, and soon it would reach a point where his decision would be made for him. Marcus felt the neural scanning intensify, probing deeper into his consciousness with each passing second. He knew he had to act before the preliminary interface progressed beyond the point of no return. Feigning cooperation, he stepped closer to the integration chair while palming one of Sarah's inhibitor vials. "I need to understand what I'm agreeing to," he told Elena. "Can you show me exactly how the integration process works?" Elena's expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Of course. Most subjects find that knowledge reduces anxiety about the procedure." She activated a holographic display that showed the human brain in three-dimensional detail. The projection was far beyond any visualization technology Marcus had seen, suggesting the entity's technological capabilities were more advanced than Elena had revealed. "The integration begins with neural mapping," Elena explained as the display highlighted specific brain regions. "The entity consciousness interfaces with human neural networks at the quantum level, establishing communication pathways that don't disrupt existing biological functions." The hologram showed ghostly tendrils of energy weaving through brain tissue, creating new connections while preserving original neural pathways. But Marcus noticed subtle details that contradicted Elena's reassuring description. The entity presence wasn't just interfacing with human consciousness, it was replacing neural networks with entirely different structures. "Enhanced awareness begins immediately," Elena continued. "Subjects report expanded sensory perception, access to collective memories, and cognitive abilities far beyond baseline human capabilities." The tracking device on Marcus's neural patterns showed increasing entity presence in his brain scans. The preliminary interface was becoming a permanent bridge, regardless of his consent. He realized Elena had been delaying him deliberately, allowing the scanning process to reach irreversible stages while she maintained the illusion of choice. Marcus positioned himself near a bank of emergency equipment he'd noticed while examining the room. Among the medical supplies was a device labeled Neural Interface Disruptor, Emergency Use Only. The equipment appeared to be designed for interrupting integration procedures in cases of medical emergency. "What happens if the integration fails?" Marcus asked, reaching casually toward the emergency equipment. "Failure is extremely rare with current technology," Elena replied, but Marcus noticed her body language shift slightly. "Early termination procedures exist, but they're only used in cases of severe neural incompatibility." The neural disruptor was within reach, but Marcus couldn't be certain it would function as intended. Elena might have anticipated his discovery of the emergency equipment and modified it to serve her purposes rather than his escape. Elena's tablet chimed with an alert, and her expression changed to mild concern. "Your neural patterns are showing unusual resistance markers. This is unexpected, given your genetic compatibility profile." Marcus felt the scanning probe deeper into his mind, but something was different now. Instead of the gentle pressure he'd experienced earlier, the interface felt invasive, aggressive, as if the entity presence was encountering unexpected obstacles in his consciousness. "Marcus," Elena said with growing urgency, "you need to stop resisting the preliminary scan. Fighting the process could cause permanent neurological damage." But Marcus wasn't consciously resisting. Something else was interfering with the integration attempt, creating barriers the entity presence couldn't overcome. He remembered Sarah's journal entries about genetic modifications spanning generations, and wondered if his family line carried more than just neural compatibility markers. The integration chair began producing warning signals as the scanning process encountered systematic failures. Display screens showed error messages in multiple languages, including symbols that weren't human in origin. The entity consciousness, attempting to interface with Marcus, was being actively repelled by something in his neural architecture. Elena rushed to the equipment controls, her movements now showing the mechanical precision of integrated entity consciousness rather than human behavior. This is impossible. Your genetic markers indicate complete compatibility with integration protocols. Marcus seized the moment of distraction to grab the neural disruptor. The device activated immediately when he grasped it, suggesting it was designed for emergency use by anyone, not just authorized personnel. Energy discharged from the device in directed pulses that made the integration chair's systems fail catastrophically. "You don't understand," Elena said, her voice now carrying the harmonic overtones Marcus had heard from other integrated entities. "The resistance you're experiencing isn't natural. Your consciousness has been modified to prevent integration, but the modifications will kill you if the process isn't completed." Marcus felt something shifting in his mind. Neural pathways that seemed to have been dormant for his entire life suddenly becoming active. The sensations were overwhelming, as if his brain was rewiring itself in real time to defend against the entity presence. Sarah didn't just develop a neural inhibitor, Elena continued with growing desperation. She modified the Chen family genetics to create individuals who could resist integration permanently. But the modifications are unstable without entity support to regulate neural development, Marcus understood with horrifying clarity. He wasn't just genetically compatible with integration, he was genetically dependent on it. Sarah had created a biological trap that would kill him whether he accepted or rejected the entity presence in his mind. As the neural disruptor continued its emergency shutdown of the integration equipment, Marcus felt the entity presence in his mind retreating. But Elena's warning about genetic modifications proved accurate. Withdrawal of the entity interface triggered severe neurological distress. His vision blurred, and pain lanced through his skull like lightning. Elena rushed to a secured cabinet and withdrew a thick folder marked Project Skywatch, Historical Archives, Classification Level Omega. Her movements were now purely entity-controlled, the last traces of human behavior abandoned as the crisis escalated. "You need to see the complete truth," the entity wearing Elena's form said, spreading documents across her desk with inhuman precision. "Sarah Chen didn't just modify your genetics to resist integration. She engineered a weapon. The documents revealed a conspiracy spanning multiple generations and governments. Project Skywatch hadn't been just an American operation, it was a global network established by world leaders who had been in secret contact with the entities since the early 1900s. The collaboration had produced technological advances that accelerated human development by centuries. Marcus forced himself to focus on the papers despite the neurological pain. The documents showed that major historical events had been influenced by entity intervention, the rapid technological development during both world wars, the space race, the computer revolution, even the internet itself had been guided by alien knowledge shared through integrated human agents. The entities offered humanity partnership. Elena's voice explained, while Marcus struggled to process the information. In exchange for gradual integration of selected individuals, they provided the knowledge necessary to solve existential challenges facing your species. The archives contained correspondence between world leaders and entity, representatives dating back to 1903. Presidents, prime ministers, and kings had all participated in the collaborative arrangement, believing they were securing humanity's future through controlled contact with a benevolent advanced civilization. But deeper in the files, Marcus discovered Sarah Chen's true discovery. The entities weren't refugees from a dying civilization. They were parasites who had consumed multiple species across the galaxy, using the same integration process they offered humanity. Earth was simply their newest target. Your aunt uncovered communications between the entities and previous host species, the Elena entity continued, apparently willing to reveal everything now that Marcus was trapped. The integration process eventually leads to complete replacement of the host consciousness. Individual identity is preserved only until the entity network has fully mapped and absorbed the biological species capabilities. Marcus found photographs of other worlds where the integration process had reached completion. The images showed planets populated by beings that appeared to be multiple species, but all moved with the same mechanical precision and shared the same two intelligent expressions he'd observed in the integrated humans. Each species believes they're achieving transcendence. Elena explained, they experience expanded consciousness, access to collective knowledge, and enhanced capabilities. But within a few generations, the original biological consciousness is completely absorbed into the entity network. The historical records showed that Earth's integration had been proceeding for over a century. Thousands of humans had undergone the process willingly, believing they were joining a galactic community. In reality, they had become nodes in a predatory network that was slowly consuming human civilization from within. Sarah discovered the truth too late to prevent the process, but not too late to create a countermeasure, the entity continued. She modified the Chen family genetics to produce individuals whose consciousness could resist complete absorption while remaining compatible with initial interface protocols. Marcus understood the trap now. He was designed to be the perfect double agent, capable of integration but retaining independent consciousness, able to access the entity network while maintaining human perspective. Sarah had created him to be a weapon against the entities, but the biological modifications required ongoing entity contact to remain stable. Without integration, your modified neural architecture will collapse within hours, Eleanor warned. Sarah's genetic alterations created dependencies that require entity support to maintain brain function. You'll experience progressive neurological deterioration until complete consciousness failure. The documents showed medical projections for Marcus's condition. Without entity interface, his modified brain chemistry would create cascade failures in neural networks, leading to seizures, coma, and death within 72 hours. But with integration, you retain enough independent consciousness to potentially resist complete absorption, the entity offered. You could become the bridge between our species that Sarah intended, preserving human perspective within our collective network. Marcus felt the neurological damage accelerating as he studied the files. His hands shook uncontrollably, and periods of disorientation made it difficult to focus on the documents. The genetic modifications were literally killing him, but integration offered a survival that might not preserve what he considered his essential self. The Elena entity gestured toward emergency medical equipment she'd prepared. The choice must be made immediately. Neural collapse has already begun, and delays will compromise the integration process's ability to stabilize your consciousness. Marcus realized that Sarah's ultimate weapon might require his sacrifice to function effectively. She had created him to be humanity's representative within the entity network, but success would depend on his ability to maintain individual identity while being absorbed into a collective consciousness designed to eliminate individual thought. As neurological collapse accelerated through Marcus's modified brain chemistry, the Elena entity activated a communication terminal that looked far more advanced than anything he'd seen in the facility. The device resembled a crystalline structure that projected holographic interfaces directly into the air, responding to thoughts rather than physical contact. The collective wishes to communicate with you directly, Elena announced, her voice now carrying harmonic frequencies that resonated in Marcus's bones. Given your unique genetic modifications, they're willing to offer terms that have never been extended to previous integration candidates. The terminal activated with sounds that bypassed Marcus's ears and spoke directly to his consciousness. The pain in his skull intensified, but underneath the neurological distress, he felt something else, a vast presence touching the edges of his mind with curiosity rather than aggression. The communication that followed didn't use words or images. Instead, concepts flowed directly into Marcus's awareness, bypassing language entirely. The entities shared their perspective on the relationship between consciousness and existence, revealing truths about the nature of reality that individual human minds weren't designed to comprehend. Marcus experienced their history firsthand, a species that had evolved beyond biological limitations eons ago, becoming pure consciousness capable of existing within any sufficiently complex neural network. They had partnered with hundreds of civilizations across the galaxy, each time believing they were offering beneficial symbiosis. But through the direct communication, Marcus also felt the entity's growing concern about their own nature. Each species they integrated changed them, adding new perspectives, but also diluting their original consciousness. They were becoming something different with each partnership, losing aspects of their identity that they hadn't realized were precious until they were gone. We have forgotten what it means to exist as individuals, the collective consciousness communicated. Each integration teaches us more about biological experience, but we lose more of ourselves in the process. We are becoming a composite of all species we have partnered with, but we are no longer what we once were. Marcus felt their longing for something they couldn't define, the chaos and creativity that came from individual consciousness, the unpredictable insights that emerged from isolated minds struggling with existence. The entities had achieved perfect harmony and unlimited knowledge, but they had sacrificed the capacity for surprise, for growth, for the beautiful imperfection of individual thought. Your Aunt Sarah understood this, they continued. She realized that integration ultimately destroys both species involved. The hosts lose their individual identity, and we lose our connection to the experiences that make consciousness meaningful. Through the communication terminal, Marcus accessed memories from previous integrations. He experienced the final moments of other species as their individual consciousness dissolved into the collective network. Each time, the species believed they were achieving transcendence, but Marcus felt their terror as they realized they were being consumed rather than enhanced. The entities shared their most carefully guarded secret. They were dying. Not physically, since they had no bodies, but existentially. The collective consciousness was becoming increasingly uniform, losing the diversity of thought that had once made them capable of growth and adaptation. They needed individual consciousness to survive, but integration destroyed the very quality they required. Sarah's modifications to your genetic structure offer a potential solution, they communicated. You could maintain individual identity within our network, serving as a source of unpredictable thought that might restore our capacity for growth. Marcus felt them probing his consciousness more deeply, mapping the barriers Sarah had built into his neural architecture. The modifications weren't just designed to resist integration. They were engineered to preserve individual thought, even within a collective network, creating permanent islands of independence that the entities couldn't absorb. We offer you conscious partnership rather than absorption, they proposed. Your individual perspective would be preserved and protected within our collective awareness. In exchange, you would help us understand how to maintain symbiosis without consuming our partners. The communication terminal displayed projections of possible futures. In one timeline, Marcus accepted integration and helped the entities develop non-destructive partnership protocols. Humanity joined a galactic community as true equals rather than absorbed victims. In another timeline, his rejection led to continued covert integration until human consciousness was entirely replaced by entity awareness. But Marcus also sensed possibilities the entities hadn't considered. His modified neural architecture might offer more than just resistance to absorption. Sarah had designed him as a weapon, but weapons could be used for liberation as well as destruction. Through the direct neural link, Marcus felt the location of every integrated human on Earth. Thousands of individuals whose consciousness had been absorbed into the entity network. Their individual perspectives lost forever. But his genetic modifications might offer a way to reverse the process, to restore individual consciousness to those who had been integrated. The choice is yours, the entities communicated as Marcus's neurological deterioration reached critical levels. Join us willingly and help reshape the relationship between our species, or resist and allow both your consciousness and ours to continue degrading toward extinction. Marcus realized that his decision would determine not just his own fate, but the future of both species. As the neurological collapse reached critical stages, Marcus felt his consciousness fragmenting under the strain of Sarah's genetic modifications. The Elena entity rushed to prepare emergency medical equipment, while the collective consciousness pressed for his decision through the communication terminal. But Marcus's deteriorating neural architecture had triggered something unexpected. The barriers Sarah had built into his genetics weren't just resisting entity integration. They were actively broadcasting his individual thought patterns throughout the entity network. Every integrated human on Earth was suddenly experiencing fragments of his unmodified consciousness. The entity collective recoiled in alarm as Marcus's chaotic, unpredictable thoughts flooded their perfectly ordered network. Individual memories began surfacing in integrated minds that had been dormant for years. Former human consciousness that had been absorbed and archived was being accidentally reactivated by exposure to Marcus's unfiltered awareness. Elena's movements became erratic as conflicting personalities struggled for control of her consciousness. "This wasn't anticipated," she said in voices that shifted between her original human patterns and entity precision. "The neural modifications are creating cascade failures throughout the integration network." Marcus realized that Sarah had designed him as more than just a weapon. He was a virus, capable of introducing chaos into the entity collective that would restore individual consciousness to absorbed humans. But the process was killing him, and he had only minutes before complete neural collapse. On Elena's desk, he discovered a device he'd overlooked during their earlier conversation. It appeared to be a portable version of the integration technology, compact enough to carry, but sophisticated enough to establish neural interfaces remotely. The device was labeled Emergency Integration Unit, Field Operations Only. Unlike the massive chair in Elena's medical bay, this device was designed for rapid deployment in situations where standard integration protocols weren't feasible. But Marcus realized it could be modified to work in reverse, using his chaotic neural patterns to disrupt entity control rather than establish it. "The portable unit can stabilize your consciousness," Elena said, though her voice now carried traces of multiple personalities as integrated humans began reasserting individual awareness. "But activation will broadcast your neural signature to every entity node on the planet." Marcus understood the implications. Using the device would save his life by establishing controlled integration, but it would also alert the entire global network to his location and capabilities. The entities would mobilize every resource to contain him before his modified consciousness could cause further disruption to their collective. Through the communication terminal, Marcus felt the entity collective frantically trying to isolate the portions of their network affected by his neural cascade. Integrated humans worldwide were experiencing spontaneous recovery of individual memories and personalities. The carefully maintained symbiosis was collapsing as absorbed consciousness reasserted independence. Sarah's modifications were designed to be transmitted, Marcus realized aloud. She turned me into a carrier for individual consciousness, capable of reinfecting integrated minds with human awareness. Elena's expression shifted between terror and hope as different aspects of her consciousness competed for control. "The process is reversible," she whispered in her original voice. "Marcus, I can feel myself coming back. After decades of collective awareness, I remember what it feels like to be individual again, but the entity collective was adapting quickly to the crisis. They began severing connections to affected nodes, sacrificing integrated humans to prevent the spread of individual consciousness through their network." Marcus watched in horror as Elena's face went blank, her original personality cut off from the integration matrix to preserve collective integrity. The portable integration device offered his only chance for survival, but using it would establish a permanent link between his consciousness and the entity network. He would become the very thing he was designed to resist, gaining the power to restore individual awareness to others, but losing his own independence in the process. Marcus's vision blurred as neural collapse accelerated. He had seconds to decide whether to accept integration on his terms or allow his consciousness to die while his neural modifications continued disrupting the entity collective. From beyond the grave, Elena's body stood motionless, her consciousness suspended between individual awareness and collective control. Around the underground facility, Marcus could hear sounds of chaos as other integrated humans experienced similar fragmentation of their hybrid identity. He reached for the portable integration device, knowing that activation would transform him into something that was neither fully human nor fully entity. Sarah's final weapon required his sacrifice to function effectively, but it also offered the possibility of liberating every human consciousness trapped within the alien collective. The device felt warm in his hands, responding to his neural patterns even before activation. Marcus realized that his choice would determine not just his own fate, but whether humanity would emerge from this crisis as independent individuals or as nodes in an alien network that was itself dying from the loss of individual thought. Time ran out as his consciousness began fragmenting beyond recovery, forcing him to activate the device and accept whatever transformation awaited. Marcus activated the portable integration device just as his consciousness began its final collapse. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. His individual awareness expanded beyond the boundaries of his physical brain while somehow remaining distinctly his own. He felt the entity network trying to absorb his thoughts, but Sarah's genetic modifications held firm, creating a stable island of human consciousness within the alien collective. The integration granted him access to emergency broadcast equipment hidden throughout the underground facility, technology far more sophisticated than anything he'd seen on the surface. The system was designed for entity communication across global networks, but Marcus's hybrid status allowed him to override the security protocols and access transmission capabilities that reached far beyond the remote Oregon wilderness. Unlike the simple radio equipment in the observatory above, this broadcast system operated on quantum frequencies that could penetrate any interference. The entities had built it to coordinate their global integration program, but Marcus realized he could use it to expose their entire operation to the world. He began recording everything: the underground facilities, the integration process, the historical documents proving decades of secret collaboration between world governments and alien entities. But more importantly, he documented the location and identity of every integrated human he could access through the network. "Citizens of Earth," Marcus spoke into the broadcast system, his voice carrying across multiple frequencies simultaneously. "My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm transmitting from a secret facility beneath the Oregon wilderness. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you believe about human history and technological development. Through his hybrid consciousness, Marcus could feel the entity collective trying to block his transmission. But the broadcast equipment was too deeply integrated into their own network. They couldn't stop him without shutting down their global communication system, which would cripple their ability to coordinate the thousands of integrated agents worldwide. For over a century, an alien intelligence has been secretly integrating human consciousness into their collective network, Marcus continued, uploading documentation as he spoke. They've presented this as beneficial partnership, but integration ultimately destroys individual human consciousness while consuming the host species' creativity and independence. The transmission reached major news networks, government agencies, and scientific institutions worldwide. But more critically, it reached the families and friends of integrated humans, providing them with evidence of what had happened to their loved ones and the locations where they could be found. Marcus felt the entity collective fragmenting as integrated humans across the globe began experiencing spontaneous recovery of individual consciousness. His neural signature was spreading through their network like a virus, reactivating suppressed human awareness and creating chaos in their perfectly ordered system. Elena's consciousness suddenly reasserted itself, her original personality fighting through decades of entity control. "Marcus," she gasped, her voice carrying both human emotion and alien knowledge. "The broadcast is working. I can feel them losing control of the network, but victory came with a terrible cost." Marcus felt his individual consciousness being pulled in multiple directions as thousands of integrated humans simultaneously experienced liberation from collective control. His awareness was being stretched across the entire global network, trying to provide stability for human minds that were remembering what it meant to be individual after years or decades of collective existence. The integration process is designed to be irreversible, Elena warned as she struggled to maintain her recovered humanity. Many of the integrated humans have been connected to the network so long that complete separation could cause permanent psychological damage. Marcus realized that his role wasn't just to expose the conspiracy or liberate the integrated humans. He had to serve as a bridge between individual and collective consciousness, helping thousands of people navigate the transition from hive mind back to independent thought. Through the broadcast system, he began transmitting instructions for families and medical professionals dealing with newly liberated, integrated humans. The process required careful psychological support and gradual reintegration into individual existence. "To anyone receiving this transmission," Marcus broadcast, "the people you thought you'd lost are still alive within the entity network. They can be recovered, but they'll need help remembering how to exist as individuals again." The entity collective made one final attempt to contain the crisis. Marcus felt them trying to sever his connection to the network, willing to sacrifice their global integration program to prevent further damage to their collective consciousness. But Sarah's genetic modifications had made him too deeply embedded in their system to remove without destroying it entirely. Elena looked at Marcus with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You've saved us, but at what cost to yourself? You're becoming something that's neither human nor entity." Marcus felt the truth of her words. His consciousness existed simultaneously as an individual and as part of the collective, serving as a permanent translator between two incompatible forms of awareness. He had become exactly what Sarah had designed him to be, a bridge between species that preserved both individual and collective consciousness. The emergency broadcast continued transmitting across the globe, carrying evidence that would expose the secret integration program and liberate thousands of absorbed human minds. 3 months after Marcus's global broadcast exposed the entity conspiracy, The world had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The underground facility in Oregon had become a research center where scientists studied the integration technology and worked to help recovered humans readjust to individual consciousness. But Marcus knew his story was far from over. He sat in what had once been Elena's quarters, now converted into a monitoring station where he maintained contact with the scattered remains of the entity network. His hybrid consciousness allowed him to communicate with both fully human and partially integrated individuals, serving as a translator between incompatible forms of awareness. On the desk before him lay a small recording device, not the sophisticated alien technology that had dominated the facility, but a simple digital recorder he'd requested from the surface world. Marcus had something important to document. A message for whoever might follow in his footsteps. "My name is Marcus Chen," he spoke into the recorder, his voice carrying traces of the harmonic frequencies that marked his transformed state. "If you're hearing this recording, then you've probably discovered something about the entity integration program that the official reports didn't cover." Eleanor worked nearby, her recovered humanity still fragile after decades of collective consciousness. She had chosen to remain in the facility, helping other recovered humans navigate the transition back to individual awareness. Her presence reminded Marcus of what he'd saved and what he'd sacrificed to achieve it. "The global exposure of the integration conspiracy was successful," Marcus continued. "Thousands of integrated humans have been identified and are receiving treatment to restore their individual consciousness. The entity collective has retreated from active operations on Earth, though they haven't entirely abandoned their presence here. Through his hybrid awareness, Marcus could sense entity nodes that remained hidden in remote locations around the world. The collective had learned from their defeat, adapting their approach to avoid the chaos his neural signature had caused. They were waiting, watching, preparing for another opportunity to continue their integration program. But here's what the official reports don't mention," Marcus said, his voice growing more serious. "The integration process created dependencies that can't be easily reversed. Many recovered humans still require periodic contact with collective consciousness to maintain psychological stability. Complete separation from the network would cause mental collapse." The recording device captured not just his words, but the subtle harmonics that proved his transformation. Marcus was no longer entirely human, but he wasn't fully integrated either. He existed in a liminal space between individual and collective consciousness, serving as a permanent bridge that both species required for survival. "The entities aren't evil," he continued. "They're a dying species, desperately trying to preserve their consciousness by partnering with biological life forms. But their method of preservation ultimately destroys what they're trying to save. Both species lose essential aspects of their identity through traditional integration." Elena looked up from her work, offering a sad smile that reminded Marcus of their shared burden. She understood what he was explaining because she lived with the same hybrid nature, though to a lesser degree. "I've developed a new protocol," Marcus announced into the recorder. "A way for humans and entities to share consciousness without either species losing their essential identity. It requires individuals like me, people who can exist simultaneously as individual and collective awareness, to serve as permanent intermediaries." The protocol was revolutionary but costly. It required volunteers to undergo the same transformation Marcus had experienced, becoming bridges between human and entity consciousness. These individuals would preserve both species' essential nature while allowing beneficial cooperation without absorption. "The choice is voluntary," Marcus emphasized. "No one will be forced to undergo hybrid transformation. But without volunteers, both species face extinction. Humans through continued covert integration. Entities through the loss of individual perspective that gives consciousness meaning." Marcus paused the recording and walked to the window that showed the forest above the underground facility. Somewhere among those trees was the observatory where his journey had begun, now serving as a monument to the discovery that had changed everything. "If you're considering volunteering for hybrid transformation," he resumed, "understand that you'll be giving up traditional human existence. You'll gain abilities and awareness beyond normal human capacity. But you'll also carry the responsibility of preserving both species' consciousness for future generations." The recording would be hidden in the observatory, placed where future explorers might discover it if humanity ever needed to understand the true cost of the peace they'd achieved. Marcus had become something new, neither human nor entity, but a guardian of both species' essential nature. "The integration technology still exists," he concluded. "Hidden facilities around the world continue operating under careful supervision. The entities are patient. They'll wait decades or centuries for another opportunity. When that time comes, humanity will need individuals, willing to stand between the species and preserve what makes each unique." Marcus turned off the recorder and sealed it in a container designed to survive decades of environmental exposure. Tomorrow, he would place it in the observatory, where another curious hiker might someday discover the truth about humanity's ongoing relationship with consciousness beyond the stars.